Welcome back to part 2 of how to enhance your clamshells. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I encourage you to go back and review that, because what we talked about there was more the why and the biomechanics as to how we break down the clamshell to prescribe it correctly. Now in this video, part 2, we were talking about the how. How do we execute it based off the 2 archetypes that we talked about? Before we can jump into the modifications for the wide and the narrow, let's first look at our textbook clamshell execution. So what you will typically see is you will have your patient inside lying, and then what I like to do as far as the textbook goes is really just make my way from the head down. So we want to start with a neutral spine. You can have a pillow or have their arm underneath if you don't have a pillow. And then we're looking for stacked positions, right? We need the shoulders to be stacked over each other. We need the hips to be stacked over each other. We need the knees and the ankles all to be stacked over one another. Typically people like to roll back, specifically with that right side being back compared to the left. And then overall, we like to cue them to have a slight posterior pelvic tilt. And then when they raise their knees up, what we're looking for is for them to raise their knee as high as they can without allowing their pelvis to roll back. So that's the typical way that most of us run our patients through a clamshell, right? Well, this video is all about modifications and looking to get more specific so we can have success with the clamshell. So what I want to do is just bring it and break it down in a way that is really simplified, because I understand this can look confusing, but actually it's a very straightforward way of thinking. We're just changing our language a little bit. So in order to understand the modifications, right, because when you modify something, you should know exactly why you are doing it, right? Not just because it's something you saw on social media or it's something that you think would look cool or that you think your patient would look cool, but it's actually for a very specific intentional reason, right? And all we need to understand are 2 concepts, and those concepts are compression and expansion. Now in part 1, we talked about certain areas of our wide and narrow archetypes that are either compressed or expanded. So I want you to remember those principles, and all you're looking to do is set your patient up for success by putting them into more of a biomechanical advantage for what they're weak at, right? We are trying to set them up to get them good at what they're bad at. For example, if we were dealing with someone that has compression at this lower posterior aspect of the pelvis, we want to make sure that we're not causing overcompression with our clamshell. So we need to do certain things to make sure that they aren't getting overcompressed and complaining of way too much muscle activity and or potentially impingement. And then on the other side of the spectrum, if someone is too expanded here, which we typically see with our wides, we need to help them get a little bit more compression so that they actually have a chance to be successful, right? So what this is all about is finding the right starting position and the right cues so you can set your specific patients up for success. So let's first break down our wide ISAs. Now, I find it really helpful to really grasp these concepts in more of a bullet form fashion. So what I'm gonna do is kind of go by checkpoints, so that way you can easily compare and contrast the wide versus the narrow. So in the first video, we talked about how our wide ISAs are better at internal rotation, adduction, and extension. So as it relates to the clamshell, they're starting in a biomechanical position that is weak, right? They are weak at external rotation, abduction, and flexion. That's what the clamshell is really all about. So our wide ISAs are starting in a weak position. Again, if that doesn't make sense, remember the wide ISAs are normally more in a nutated and more biased towards an anterior pelvic tilt. That nutation is going to provide eccentric or length to this posterior pelvis, which is really the muscles that we're working with the clamshell. So they're starting in a biomechanical disadvantage. So what's the typical response? Typically for these individuals, they don't really feel the clamshell that much, or they have to bring and abduct their legs so much that, yeah, they may feel it, but they're actually then creating secondary compensations, right? So these are the individuals that do it and they're just like, yeah, I don't really feel it, right? So what are some modifications? Well, we need to provide them compression where they have expansion. They have expansion here, so how do we set them up to get a little bit more compressed here? Well, we can cue them and teach them how to properly posterior pelvic tilt, right? So if they are in an anterior pelvic tilt, everything's gonna be more in a lengthened position as it relates to our posterior pelvis. So we need to teach them how to tuck that pelvis and get into more of a posterior orientation. These individuals are going to respond better with higher amounts of knee and hip flexion, right? As you start approaching that 90-degree mark, you start naturally going into more of a posterior pelvic tilt. That's going to be really advantageous for these people. We're going to make sure that they don't go into their anterior pelvic tilt, right? Because even if you put them in a posterior pelvic tilt, chances are they're going to try to abduct and externally rotate the femur, but then drive their natural anterior orientation. So we really have to watch out for that. So the big overarching statement here is we need to get these people more compressed here. And we do that with compression and posterior pelvic tilts, posterior orientation of the pelvis, and then really watching that they don't revert back to their typical presentation and patterns that they really like. So now we have our narrow ISAs. They are better at external rotation, flexion, and abduction. Well, the clamshell is just that, right? So they come into the clamshell at a biomechanically strengthened position. Their typical response is going to be complaining of over muscle activity, potentially pinching, right? These are the ones that they barely AB and externally rotate their leg, and they are very sensitive in saying that they really feel their glutes. Well, why is that happening? That's happening because they're already coming in more of a posterior orientation and a compressed orientation. Trust me, if you start building compression on top of compression, you're going to start driving patterns further and further, and that patient that's coming to you to fix a dysfunction is probably going to have more dysfunction, right? We really need to get them good at what they're bad at. So these individuals have too much compression here. The clamshell is going to add compression. So number one, what we need to think about is the clamshell the best for our narrow ISAs? Again, it's going to be patient dependent. However, something like a split stance deadlift could be a better alternative for your narrow ISAs. Why? The split stance deadlift is going to work on eccentric orientation back here, right? So we start lengthening back here when we start doing this hip shifting activity like a split stance deadlift. That's going to provide them a little bit more of an anterior orientation, right? They're too compressed, so we need a little bit more anterior orientation. So that's the first thing you need to start with is the clam good for that narrow ISA? Again, that's up to you. Use your clinical judgment and use your tests and measurement to really understand. But when it comes to narrows, I'm first thinking maybe there's a different alternative for the clamshell. If you decide to do the clamshell, just like we walked through with our wide, we're trying to get them a little bit more space back here, right? They're too compressed. So what we want to think about is they are going to want to be in this posterior pelvic tilt. So we need to make sure that they are at least neutral. And depending on how compressed, we might want a tiny bit of an anterior pelvic tilt, right? Just depends on the person. And we can drive that through the femurs, right? So we could have less hip flexion, right? As you start to lower the knees and the hips from that 90-degree mark, you're going to start to naturally anteriorly tilt the pelvis, right? And then you want to make sure that as they go up into their clamshell, that they're not reverting and kind of tucking under and trying to drive that strength-driven pattern that they have of the posterior pelvic tilt. All right, so with our narrows, we're thinking, how do we get more space? We need to think about, is the clamshell the best exercise? Maybe, maybe not. If it is, we want to set them up and make sure they're not in too much of a posterior pelvic tilt bias, because that's going to drive compression on top of compression, which is going to lead to further dysfunction.